Well, welcome back to part 3 of our continuing study about the atonement. And when we talk about the atonement, we're talking about how the life, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus serves to save mankind. And all Christians are pretty much in agreement that Jesus' life and his death and resurrection reconciles human beings to God. Where we differ is how this takes place. And this is what this whole study is about. As I've said before, I'm looking at this more historically than I am theologically, from the standpoint is I'm not necessarily promoting one theory over another, although I will point out what I believe are deficiencies in each of the theories as we go along. That being the case, I want us to see how the different atonement theories have developed over the years and see how Christianity has changed. So with that, let's go ahead and get going. You might notice that rather than doing a new slide presentation each week, as I normally do, I am building one great big slide presentation for this study. And I just want to keep it all in one file. And so I'll be jumping around from slide to slide as we go along. These are the atonement theories on the screen that we have been looking at. We've already looked at in the last couple of weeks the ransom theory and the recapitulation theory, which has been summarized in this term Christus Victor in a book in 1931 of the same name. Today we'll look at the satisfaction theory, and in the coming weeks we'll look at moral influence and the penal substitution theory. Now I've said all along, the atonement theory, what we believe about the atonement, will have a profound impact on how we view God and how we see him and understand him. And this will be something that's very important as we develop our image of God. And also, the atonement theory that we adopt will be a reflection of our understanding of justice. As I mentioned last week, at least in my own life, I've noticed both professionally as a lawyer and theologically as a Christian, I've noticed different ways of understanding justice. I've noticed some people view justice as making sure a wrongdoer gets his due, punishing a wrongdoer. Other people view justice as making things right, which may or may not include punishing a wrongdoer. But just to punish a wrongdoer simply for the sake of punishment, the folks on that side wouldn't consider that necessarily to be justice. So how we understand justice will have a profound impact on how we understand the atonement. So with this, let's go into a little bit of review, and then we'll go on to the satisfaction theory. The last couple of weeks, we've been looking at what I'm calling the classic atonement models. These are the ransom, recapitulation, Christus Victor models. These are the models that that the church followed or accepted during the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And they are still being accepted by Eastern Orthodox denominations. Remember that in about 1054, there was what was called the Great Schism, where the church split into two, the Western Church becoming the Roman Catholic Church, and then the Eastern churches becoming the Orthodox denominations. And that split remains to this day. And of course, in 1500s, we had the Protestant Reformation that only affected the Western churches. So you have the split in 1054 between the West and the East, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. And I may have my hands switched up here from west to east or east to west. And then in the 1500s, we had another split within the Western church between the Roman Catholic and the Protestants. There has been no quote unquote Protestant Reformation for the Eastern Orthodox denominations. So with the first 1,000 years, the classic atonement models were accepted by the church, and now they are still accepted as the explanation of the atonement by the Eastern Orthodox denominations. And under these models, the essence of sin was this, that man failed to live up to his image of God. And man was therefore in bondage to sin and to death and to Satan. The solution lay in that Jesus lived the perfect life. And as such, he was the perfect reflection of the image of God. And we see this in Hebrews 1:3. His Son is the radiance of his glory, the very image of his substance, and upholding all things by the word of his power, who when he had by himself purified us of our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. So in this, we see that Jesus defeated all the powers of evil. This is what the classic atonement models say. Now, they deal with Satan differently, but there's a big focus on Satan. With the ransom theory, the proponents of the ransom theory say that Satan essentially was paid off, that Jesus paid a ransom to Satan. The recapitulation Christus Victor models say, now it wasn't so much a ransom that was paid to Satan, but rather Satan was defeated. But in either case, the focus is on Satan. And this is one of the biggest objections to this model, that there is the focus is on Satan and man rather than on God himself. God is almost a spectator on the sidelines in these models. And that's probably an overstatement on my part. God is very much involved, but this is very much what Jesus is doing to Satan, either paying him off or defeating him. Even in the ransom model, by paying Satan off, Jesus is defeating Satan. There's the whole explanation of that, but there's a victory there, even in the payment of the ransom. Okay, so with these objections, we see the danger of atonement models. And this comes from newadvent.org, I mentioned last week. I love this website. It's very, very helpful in seeing some of the early church father information. However, it is a Roman Catholic website. But I like that because I like seeing how the Catholics explain things, even if I don't necessarily agree with them. It's good to see their explanations. This is what this website says about the ransom theory in particular. But however useful and illuminating in their proper place, figures of this kind are perilous in the hands of those who press them too far and forget that they are figures. And this is what happened here. When a captive is ransomed, the price is naturally paid to the conqueror by whom he is held in hostage. Hence, if this figure were taken and interpreted literally in all its details, in other words, taken to its logical conclusion, it would seem that the price of man's ransom must be paid to Satan. The notion is certainly startling, if not revolting. Again, this is a Catholic website, and the Catholics follow the atonement model developed by St. Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century. And St. Anselm certainly found the notion of paying a ransom to Satan to be very revolting. And he developed his whole satisfaction model in large part in response to, or in reaction to, the ransom theory. And I have found that this is the case of almost everything that comes down theologically. It is almost always a response or a reaction to something that's been taught in the past. And sometimes these pendulums can swing too far in our reactions to other teachings. Anselm wrote a book, very famous book, Cur Deus Homo, and that's in the Latin. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. In English, Why God Became Man. And this is his attempt to explain this. It's an interesting book. He's written it in the form of a dialogue between himself, Anselm, and one of his students, a gentleman by the name of Boso, B-O-S-O, Boso, I don't know. And it's a dialogue going back and forth. Boso asks questions, Anselm provides answers, and then Boso basically says, Anselm, I see how you are exactly right all along. But this is a fascinating book. Again, I would say required reading if you want to understand the atonement, at least understand the Catholic understanding of the atonement, because this is what Catholics believe even to this day. And here's how Anselm reacted to the ransom theory. As God owed nothing to the devil but punishment, So man must only make amends by conquering the devil, as man had already been conquered by him. But whatever was demanded of man, he owed to God and not to the devil. And that was his reaction to the notion that mankind owed something to the devil that had to be ransomed and paid off. Now, honestly, I think that in reacting the way he did, Anselm was reacting to what I will call a caricature of the ransom theory and not the actual ransom theory. Because as we've seen, there are plenty of verses that say that Jesus gave his life as a ransom. So there is truth to the ransom theory. The idea that Jesus is actually paying off Satan, I think that goes beyond what the ransom theory was intended to say, at least in the beginning. So Anselm is responding to the ransom theory, and he's pointing out that man owes something to God. And this is a central theme with Anselm, this idea of debt. It runs throughout this book. Man owing something to God. God ends up owing something to Jesus. Jesus ends up giving it to man. So man owes something more to God. There's constantly something being owed to somebody. And this is a new concept about the concept of debt. And Anselm starts off with the idea that man was originally created in debt to God. And this was the debt. Every wish of a rational creature should be subject to the will of God. And no one who pays this debt commits sin, but everyone who does not pay it sins. That's what Anselm says. So he starts off with the notion that every human being is in debt to God to do God's will. George MacDonald puts it like this: man's business is to do the will of God. I don't put that quote up there to suggest that MacDonald followed the satisfaction theory. He didn't. Those of us who read MacDonald are very frustrated by this because he never really sets forth what his understanding of the atonement is. He's very clear about what he understands it not to be, but he's not very clear about what he understands it to be. So keep that in mind. But I just put this quote up here just to show that there's at least some agreement between MacDonald and Anselm in terms of our duty is to do the will of God. Anselm calls it our debt. And again, this is a theme that runs throughout Anselm. When Anselm looked at sin, he didn't look at it from the standpoint of its effect on mankind. The classic theories looked at it that way. What does sin do to mankind? It separates us from God. It takes away God's image from within us. It makes us less perfect. It introduces death. All of that had to do with the effect of sin on mankind. And for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, that was the focus of the church. Anselm changes his focus. He's not looking at the effect of sin on man, but rather the effect of sin on God. And this is a new way of looking at things. And as far as Anselm is concerned, sin dishonors God. And here's another quote from the book. He who does not render this honor, which is due to God, robs God of his own and dishonors him. And this is sin. So then, everyone who sins ought to pay back the honor of which he has robbed God. And this is the satisfaction, hence the name satisfaction theory, which every sinner owes to God. And this is important to Anselm, he ought to restore more than he took away. But this is a real problem for mankind. Okay, so when we sin, according to Anselm, we don't give God our due. Our due is to make our will subject to his will. When we sin, we don't do that. We therefore dishonor God. We don't give him what is due to him. And now we have to pay it back. But our problem is we're sinners and we can't pay it back, especially if, according to Anselm, we have to restore more than we take away. This is sort of like what Zacchaeus was saying in the Old Testament standard, that if you steal something from somebody, you restore 4 times, fourfold what you've taken. And so you're giving back more than you took away. Well, Anselm is saying that when we dishonor God, we need to give back more than we took away. And here, what he's saying is that we have a choice. We either have to satisfy God by paying back a debt or be punished. For Anselm, forgiveness without satisfaction is unworthy of God. And this was a reflection of Anselm's view of justice. As far as Anselm is concerned, all sin has to be dealt with either through satisfaction, through paying back a debt, or by the sinner being punished. And as far as he's concerned, you cannot have forgiveness without satisfaction or punishment, which is, we'll come back to this notion a little bit later on. If not today, then our next lesson. But this is a very important point that we need to understand. For Anselm, forgiveness requires satisfaction. This is also true of the penal substitution theory of the atonement. There must be punishment first and then forgiveness. Okay, here we have what I'm going to switch hats now. I'm taking off my Sunday school teacher's hat, putting on my lawyer's hat. We are looking at here a distinction between what I'm calling the civil justice model of the judicial system and the criminal justice model. In our judicial system, if you do something wrong, depending on what you do, you can either be charged with a crime in criminal court, or you can be sued for monetary damages in civil court. In a criminal court, the focus is on the criminal defendant. The focus is on punishing him. You either get punished by going to prison or paying a fine to the state, not to your victim, but to the state. And that's all about punishing the victim. In the civil justice system, the focus is on compensating the victim, not punishing the wrongdoer, but compensating the victim. So to give you a quick example, we take the case of O.J. Simpson. Several decades ago, he was accused of having killed his ex-wife and her boyfriend. And he was charged in criminal court for the murder of these two people. Well, he was found not guilty in the criminal court. Then the families of the people who died, the victims, they sued O.J. Simpson in civil court for monetary damages. So O.J. Simpson never went to prison, never paid a fine to the state for the deaths of his ex-wife and her boyfriend. But the families then sued him in civil court for compensation. And they won, and a monetary judgment was entered against O.J. Simpson in civil court. So there you see the criminal justice system and the civil justice system. They don't have to come to consistent results, but in the one, the focus is on the criminal and punishing the criminal. In the other, the focus is on compensating the victim. In our atonement models, obviously the penal justice system or the penal substitution model follows the criminal justice model, and Anselm's satisfaction theory follows the civil justice model. The classic theories for the first 1,000 years of Christianity didn't follow either one. They weren't concerned about civil or criminal justice in these terms. They were concerned about defeating Satan, defeating evil. And so you had a totally different concept. They did not follow legal metaphors. So Anselm used the civil justice model. So this raises the question, what would satisfy God's honor? What is sufficient compensation to satisfy God? And here's some suggestions from Anselm. Is it not proper that since man has departed from God as far as possible in his sin, he should make to God the greatest possible satisfaction? Okay, that's helpful, but not totally clear. He clears it up. Nothing can be more severe or difficult for man to do for God's honor than to suffer death voluntarily when he's not bound by obligation. And man cannot give himself to God in any way more truly than by surrendering himself to death for God's honor. So there's two parts here. First, surrendering yourself to death for God's honor will satisfy God. But, and this is important, when not bound by obligation to do so. It's important that the death not be simply the payment of a debt, but be a gift. God's honor is satisfied not because a debt is paid to him, but because a gift is given to him in exchange for the debt. The satisfaction must be paid out of love and not obligation. And here's the problem with that man has. Because we've already sinned, and because the wages of sin is death, we already owe God our lives. We cannot satisfy the gift of a non-obligatory death. Because if we die, it's because we already owe God death, and we can't do it. But, according to Anselm, Jesus doesn't owe his life to God. He says, for God will not demand this death of Jesus as a debt. For as no sin will be found in Jesus, Jesus ought not to die. Okay, so Jesus is perfect. He has no obligation to die. He doesn't owe God a debt of death. All of the rest of us already do. We sinned. We owe God our lives. And so we need to die. So we can't pay off God by dying because we already owe it to him, and that's not good enough. Remember that Anselm says that we have to pay God more than we owe him. We already owe him death. So we need to give him something more than that, and we can't. So Jesus has to do it because he doesn't owe God death. This also means that to Anselm, and this is an interesting sidelight, but it's important, that Jesus' death was not in itself an act of obedience to God. Okay, and here he's trying to explain what Paul meant in Philippians, where Paul says that Jesus became obedient even unto death. He's not saying that God commanded, or he's saying that what Anselm is saying is that Paul was not saying that God commanded Jesus to die and Jesus therefore obeyed God in dying. What Anselm is saying is that Jesus lived a perfect life of justice and obedience to God. And it was because of the perfectness or the perfection of his life that he was put to death. People were envious of him. People were jealous of him. People did not like the fact that he lived a perfect life. And they put him to death on account of his obedience. But his death was not an act of obedience to God. Here's how Anselm puts it. For the Father did not compel him to suffer death or even allow him to be slain against his will, but of his own accord he endured death for the salvation of man. Again, it's very important to Anselm that Jesus' death be a voluntary action on his own part. It's something that he is not compelled to do. So it cannot even be a command of God himself, a command of the Father himself. It has to be Jesus' own decision. Here, I wonder if Anselm is sort of splitting hairs within the Trinity, because when we say that Jesus died, what we're saying is God became a man and God died. And Anselm understands that, but he's still drawing this distinction between what the Father compels Jesus to do and what Jesus decides to do on his own. Here's part of the dialogue between Basso and Anselm. Basso says, it is plain that if man had not sinned, God ought not to compel him to die. Makes sense. Anselm responds, God did not therefore compel Christ to die, but he suffered death of his own will, not yielding up his life as an act of obedience, but on account of his obedience in maintaining holiness. Jesus died as a result of his righteous obedience to God, not in response to a command of God, but rather because he was obedient to God and everything else. The people that he came to save were envious of him, and because he was righteously obedient, they murdered him. So God didn't kill Jesus, essentially. Evil men killed Jesus, but Jesus laid down his life of his own accord, and that's what makes it satisfactory to God. So because Jesus died for God's honor, God now owes Jesus a reward. Okay, again, this is all part of Anselm's understanding of God's economy, where everything is about owing and a debt, owing and debt, owing and debt. Now here's the problem. Jesus didn't need a reward. Jesus didn't need anything. So what Jesus did was he passed his reward on to the rest of mankind, which resulted in our salvation. So here's the way Anselm puts it. Or can anything be more just than for him to remit all debt, since he has earned a reward greater than all debt, if given with the love which he deserves? So basically what Anselm is saying here is, because Jesus gave the Father the gift of his own life, he did it not because he was obligated to do it, but because he chose to do it. And that fact made it thoroughly acceptable to God's honor. It was a matter of God being honoring with the life of Jesus and the death of Jesus, given voluntarily by Jesus. Because of this, God owes a reward to Jesus, but because Jesus doesn't need a reward, he remits all the other debt of the rest of mankind. So Jesus' death essentially satisfies all of the debt of all of mankind. Again, this is not about Jesus being punished on behalf of mankind. There is a substitution going on here. There is a substitutionary sacrifice going here. And in fact, that's the language that's in the Christian Missionary Alliance Statement of Faith, that Jesus died as a substitutionary sacrifice. That's the language that we have in our Statement of Faith. And Anselm's satisfaction theory fits in with that language, as that he died as a substitutionary sacrifice to pay the debt that mankind owed, because mankind couldn't pay it, because we could not give more than what we already owed. And so as a result of all this, mankind is saved, and we receive salvation. Once again, this isn't penal substitution, and Jesus is not being punished in place of man. He is paying a civil debt in place of man, sort of like an insurance company, if you will. If you're in a car accident and if the accident's your fault and you end up owing the person you hit money, you're not going to pay that debt because you don't have the money to do it. Your insurance company is going to pay that debt. And in that case, your insurance company is sort of acting like Jesus. In this situation, the debt that we owed God was our lives. We couldn't pay that debt, so Jesus pays it for us, like an insurance company would pay our obligation in a civil action. As I said before, the satisfaction theory, this is the theory that is still followed by the Roman Catholics today. So in these first several theories that we've seen, the ransom / recapitulation / Christus Victor models, that classic model of the atonement, That is still followed by the Eastern Orthodox churches. The satisfaction theory is still being followed by the Roman Catholics. And so later we'll get to where the Protestants land on all this. But so far, this is where we've gotten. Okay, I'm going to leave you with this. When we come back next time, I want to look at some of the objections to the satisfaction theory and how at least one man, a man by the name of Peter Abelard, reacted to the satisfaction theory because he had serious problems with it. And he came up with his own theory, or he revitalized an older theory known as the moral influence model. And we'll look at that one. Now, as a piece of housekeeping, I may not have a lesson next week. And the reason for that is that we are having family in this week for our annual vacation. We normally take an annual vacation with our extended family. And with COVID-19, we're doing a staycation and everybody's coming to our house. So with everything going on this week, I may not have time to get the lesson prepared satisfactorily and get it posted. So if you don't see a lesson next week, that's why. And but if I get it done, I will go ahead and post it anyway. But I just let you know there may not be one next week. So with that, I'm going to let you go. Enjoy the rest of the day and the weekend, and God bless you all.